When we begin an essay or a creative nonfiction, I always tell people, start with a question, an obsession, something that you want to find out, and then find ways to find that out, whether it's actually doing research and going online and looking at things, or speculating, thinking about what could have happened if, for example, my mother did not die. That's something that I'm always thinking a lot about. I think that's where the train of thought comes in. It's one line where you begin from a question and then you eventually arrive at an answer. And that's where you get a fully polished creative nonfiction work.
Hi everyone, I'm really pleased to share this episode that I filmed with Max Pasakorn. Max is one of the top emerging young writers in Singapore today. They've been featured on the Straits Times as well as TODAYOnline, and they were published at the mere age of 21 and yet went on to win several literary awards. Today, I try my best to capture the radiance that is Max's personhood in this interview as he talks about growing up Thai in Singapore.
If there's anything I need to write about now, it's to capture this memory of a space where my mother and I used to go to a lot to eat Thai food because she was trying to study what does it mean to make Thai food for the Singaporean palate.
How he found his voice as a writer.
It's very funny because I am not what most people would conventionally think of when you think of a writer, because I didn't do literature in secondary school.
And his advice for other aspiring writers in Singapore.
When I say creative nonfiction is basically following a single train of thought, it's basically going, hey, I have this question that I want to answer for myself, and writing it out is what allows you to answer that question.
The Straits Times feature of your book opens with this line: reading Max Pasakorn's micro-memoir of questioning selfhood is like sinking your teeth into sticky toffee, as every line spills over with decadent images that tell of a deliciously complex mode of being in between worlds. With that opener, tell me about your book, A Study in Ourselves.
Yeah, of course. And thank you so much for having me. This is my book, A Study in Ourselves. It is a micro-memoir, as the Straits Times coined it, because I did not call it a micro-memoir. But essentially, it's a sort of little journey into my life here in Singapore as a queer person. And the way that I like to think about it is, for most of my life, I felt sort of out of place here in Singapore. And I was trying to figure out why is it? Being queer is definitely one big aspect of it, and as part of the book, sort of we will go through different journeys I've had. I think at one point I talk about having hookups in Singapore and how that has sort of changed the way that I view the world. But it's also about sort of my being, how I was born, what my parents were what my parents dreamed of for me. And yeah, that's where it's come together into this little thing that I like to call my little baby. The book itself is a work of creative nonfiction, but there are some elements where I take some liberties with that. This idea of what nonfiction is and what nonfiction could be. And the reason for that, I think, is when we think about queerness, I'm always thinking about how do we blur boundaries and how do we sort of shake things up, right? The queer experience to me is not about, oh, I'm falling in love with a man and we have sex and then we live the rest of our lives at a happily ever after. I don't think it's ever as clean as that. Queerness is messy, and I think the way that this book is sort of presented also reflects that sort of mess, in that it's presented as very, very short, small chapters, which is why the book is so tiny. So that's how I think this memoir came about. It was a question of hey, why don't I feel I belong here in this country called Singapore? And is it because of my queerness? And if not, what else? And so it's that question that I think threads throughout the entire book itself. Yeah.
And I really like how you play on words. I mean, you hinted a little bit at it, but I think we would be remiss not to mention the fact that actually your chapbook is very much just playing on words, right? Can you share a little bit about what you did? And I know in our pre-interview you mentioned me, and then you gave that as an example, so I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that. Yeah,
so like I mentioned earlier, this book is sort of divided into really small short chapters that are each about 2 to 5 pages, and 2 to 5 pages this size, okay, a 5-inch by 5-inch book. So it's very small, very short. And each of these sort of chapters are sort of influenced by a sort of translation of a word that I sort of thought about as a result of writing the book. So what you mentioned earlier, the first chapter is titled Me Me, right? In Chinese, like that's the word for secrets. And when I was thinking about that, like sonically speaking, when you say me, it's like, hey, it's actually about me, right? Me, like I, the person. So when those two sort of ideas came together, then that's where the chapter sort of begins, right? We think about what does it mean to be keeping secrets, and what does it mean to be keeping a secret about yourself, right? And that's where the book sort of begins, right? Of thinking about like language with the story of the memoir that is about to be told. So that's just one example. I am trilingual effectively. So I speak English, Chinese, Mandarin Chinese because I grew up in Singapore and Thai. A lot of the book's chapters are actually titled after Thai words. And these are words that, either mean something very special to me or they sort of like generate a different kind of image that we don't see with English. So one example is the Thai word for butterfly. We call it pi sia. And if you sort of break the words apart, they literally mean the ghost of the shirt. So you imagine a butterfly sort of like flying out of its cocoon that it's left because it used to be a caterpillar that could spin silk. So when I was writing that chapter, I was thinking a lot about like what does it mean to sort of like be in that stage of premature growth, or like the stage where we haven't really grown to be a butterfly yet, and we sort of like cocoon ourselves and we think about what we could be when we grow up. And yeah, so like those I think are just two of the examples. Another big example is the Thai word porn. It's very familiar to a lot of Singaporeans, I think, because there's a local celebrity called Porn Sak. And if you sort of grew up watching Channel 8 dramas in Singapore, you will see like, oh, there's this like one Thai Chinese actor who's sort of like everywhere on MediaCorp. And I remember when I was like very young, people will always be like, oh, like that Thai celebrity porn, because that's like the word that they know. But the Thai word porn actually means wish, right? So it means Oi porn means to wish somebody's goodwill or wish something good on someone. So when I was thinking about the pronunciation of the word porn and like this sort of Thai meaning of porn, I was like, oh, so what happens when you wish upon a porn star? Right? And so that's the thing. And so like a lot of the book comes about as a result of this play on words that can really only happen when you have, I think, this sort of in-betweenness of knowing different languages and how do they sort of translate into and out of each other. Yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, that answers the question really well. How did you find your voice as a writer?
Wow, my writing journey has been really long. I think it's very funny because I am not what most people would conventionally think of when you think of a writer, because I didn't do literature in secondary school. So I was in the School of Science and Technology, and the school didn't offer literature classes at all. And so I first stumbled upon creative writing first time when I was at the end of my polytechnic journey in Singapore, when I took a creative writing class. And back then I was training to be a journalist. Didn't get there in the end. But I was thinking a lot about like, okay, like how do I sort of like write stories, write poetry. And I was introduced, I think, to spoken word poetry first in that one creative writing class. And I was like, oh yeah, this is really cool. I could like write poetry and then sort of perform it with people. That was in 2017. And I guess like that entire journey from 2017 until when this book was published in 2023 was a really long one of like sort of self-discovery and understanding my own voice and what I was interested in writing about and concerned about. So I think it took that time for me to finish poly, go through NS, in college, really focus on writing in different genres and learning about writing in a creative writing space and doing a creative writing degree that got me all the way there. And so that journey is a really difficult one to take, because when I was that age of like 21, 22, I think I was very sort of like socially pressured to go into the STEM fields, right? We feel like when I grew up like not very rich, the conversations around people around me will always be like, if you do like math, if you do like engineering, if you do science, like that's the thing that will like get you a secure job and then you don't have to worry about like feeding yourself in the future. And I knew back then that like I was actually like quite okay at like coding, because I did website design for a while. And when clients have like very specific demands, you have to be like, okay, how do I figure out this JavaScript? And I was like, okay, maybe, when I go to college, I would really hone in on like being a STEM person. And when I got to college, I realized like, hey, this like that's not what I want to do in my life. And so I went back to writing, and I think having excursions like that in life is really important to sort of figure out what you want for yourself, what you feel like is a life worth living.
You once told me that creative nonfiction starts with a single thought. Can you expand on that?
The context behind that is that I sort of identify as a creative nonfiction writer because I obviously wrote like a micro memoir or a creative nonfiction book. And when we think about nonfiction in the sort of most layman terms, a lot of the times you will think of like books like Atomic Habits or like these sort of like big self-help books that are like success stories of people who have like gone through it, and then you're like, oh my gosh, I want to learn from that. I don't sort of think of it in that way. I think a lot of the times we have an idea for what we want to talk about, and we just need to sort of like take it all the way in order for us to really explore all of that, right? So as an example, like this book that we've been talking about, my first question was like, hey, what does it mean to be like in between spaces? What does it mean to be a hybrid self? What does it mean when you're Thai and Singaporean? What does it mean like when you're queer and you're like always in between different types of spaces? That was the question that I sort of began with when I was writing this book. And so as we sort of like go further and further in the writing process, then all these memories sort of started to come together, right? We have like different aspects of my childhood and then aspects of my adulthood, and then everything sort of like mishmashes together into like this, I guess, like a braid of different experiences that answers this question. And so when I say like, okay, creative nonfiction is basically following a single train of thought, it's basically going, hey, I have this question that I want to answer for myself. It can be a research question in the most academic way, or it could be like a personal question, like, why am I this way? Or like, why is the plant outside green? And why is it so beautiful outside today? Things like that. And writing it out is what allows you to answer that question. Writing it out allows you to answer that question that you've been posing for yourself. And I think a big part of that is how the writing process feeds into your train of thought or your sense of self, right? What happens when you go like, okay, I have like this weird question that I need to get an answer for, and I can fill that answer in however creatively I want. Right? That's when you start to go, oh yeah, like this is fun, this is interesting. There's facets about myself that I have not discovered because I've not thought about it in this way before. And so when we sort of begin an essay or a creative nonfiction, I always tell people, start with a question, an obsession, something that you want to find out, and then find ways to find that out, whether it's, actually doing research and like going online and looking at things, or speculating, thinking about like what could have happened if, for example, like my mother did not die. That's something that I'm always thinking a lot about. So I think that's where the train of thought comes in, and we're thinking about like, okay, it's one line where you begin from a question and then you eventually arrive at an answer, and that's where you get a fully polished like creative nonfiction work.
I love that. I love how accessible it is and how it's so simple to start, right?
Yeah.
Do you have a question, and use writing as a medium to solve question, to answer that question.
Yeah, and to add on to that, like something that people assume about creative nonfiction is that you always need to have a thesis when you go into a work, right? Because academic essays teach us that, like, we want to go in, we want to be able to say, oh yeah, for definitively this is the thing that I'm going to prove in this essay. But a lot of times we forget that there's a lot of work that goes into that before you're able to arrive at that thesis. We take a lot of thought, we explore things, and then we think about all things before the thesis sort of appears on the page. And I think I tell people that, like, when you're writing creative nonfiction, what you care about is not the conclusion, like what is the destination, but how do we get there? And I always liken it to when you're in school and the math teacher tells you, okay, this is the answer, but the answer is not enough. We need you to show the working in order for you to get the marks, right? So that's something that I always think about with creative nonfiction as well. Okay, we know that eventually, at the end of the day, we know that the writer is fine because the writer is alive to write the book, right? But we want to see the journey. We want to see the workings behind how the writer gets to this end. Yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit more about the process of publishing a book in Singapore?
Yeah, I think it really begins from asking yourself the question, like, why does this work needs to be a book? right? Why does it need to be published as a book and not as an article or as something else online? I think there's something very special about the way that a book has its own journey, right? From the beginning to the middle to the end. When you're thinking about the experience of reading a book, we're always thinking about like, okay, like there's this thing that I'm holding in my hand that allows me to begin a journey with the writer and then sort of like go through the pages until we reaches the end, and hopefully there's a sort of like climactic conclusion. And that I think should always go into like every single sort of like piece of writing that people are thinking about working on as a project, right? So for example, like I know a lot of like early writers who would be like, oh, I want to write like the next big novel. And I'm like, that's cool. You can write 200 pages, but do you feel like this 200 pages is a really good story in that container that you've chosen for it, right? It could be that the 200 pages, actually there's like one like sort of like small thread that makes a really good short story that can fit within like 15 pages. And then that becomes like the ideal container for it. I guess like what I'm saying is when we're thinking about like publishing a book, we're always thinking about like what is the container for the work and how do we sort of like use that container formally through form to be able to achieve what you want to achieve. And so like I think that's always the first thing that I'm always thinking about. And I will also quantify that like it's good to not think of the product as the final destination. So like, for example, maybe you want to write a book, right? Maybe beginning with not, I want to write a book, but I want to explore this specific idea. That might be a greater place to start. And then through your writing, through your exploration, through that single line of thought, you can see how far that takes you. And if eventually it is not a 300-page novel, but instead it's like a chapter in your life, maybe that's the best container for it and you're just building towards a larger project. That's how I guess I would think of the way form and content work together in the literary world.
I want to cut you off right now by just asking, are there any specific instances that you have encountered for yourself or other writers where you're like, this is the wrong container. This should be a short story. This should not be a book. This should be a book.
I mean, I would say that like when you're writing literature, it's ultimately up to you as an artist what you are able to see for yourself in that work, right? So I would never be like, oh, that should be a short story instead of a book. But sometimes I would, for example, like read something and be like, I feel like there's a potential for this to be longer. And that's up to the writer whether they want to take that advice. Right? Because at the end of the day, the writer is the person who's producing the work.
So going back to the other question before I cut you off.
Yeah.
Like imagine if I'm a writer and I'm just completely oblivious to this whole world of publishing and I've seen how you've been able to do it at such a young age on a really like a very basic step-by-step process. Like what are some ways in which I can get started?
Yeah, if you want to write, I think the first step is always to take writing seriously. And I say that because a lot of times, I mean, I know a lot of writers who, like, when they're first starting out, they'll just be like, oh yeah, just trying this out for fun. It's a hobby. And that joy that you get from writing and like putting words on the page, that should always stay with you as much as you can. But then there's the part where you sort of like start investing in your work, right? You go to classes, you read craft books, you talk to like other writers about what does it mean to write. That shift into the writing life is probably the most important one to take. That's you being like, okay, yeah, I'm committing to this project more so than just having it be a little thing I do on the side. So that's I think the first step. And then the second step I think is to devote time to that work. When you're considering what you want to write, how you want to write it, I think the most important thing is just to get the words on the page, try and get what you want to say out. And that, like I said, could be a very much like, okay, yeah, I have a story in my mind and I really want to like put it out, so I will like type everything out. Or it could be exploratory, right? The workings, like I said earlier, where it's, okay, like I have a question and I really want to like take it all the way. Let's see how far I can go. So that's the second step, which is to do the writing. And then once we're done with that, once you're done with the creative part of the process, then you can think about how do you package it and market it. My chapbook, the way I got it published was I submitted it to a contest when it was done, and the judge picked my book, and so I sort of got published with a publisher as a result. In order for you to sort of get to that stage, you sort of really need to know like what the book is about. And then what is the book really about? right? So I can say like, it's a micro memoir about my life in Singapore as a queer person, but it's really about living in between spaces and how do I sort of grapple with like this like larger humanity that I'm sort of like facing, right? And I think every single writer needs to take that step. Whether you take it before or after you publish, that's like a completely different question. And then from there, you can send your work to publishers. I think that's the next step, right? So once you're done with writing, maybe you've workshopped it with a few times with some people that you trust, and then you can send it out to a publisher. And in Singapore, there is, for example, Ethos Books, Aprogram Books. I think After Image Press by Singlet Station is recently coming up as well, and Landmark Books, and there's a few other sort of publishers in Singapore that you can read their website and they will tell you like what is their guidelines for submission, and you can just send it in. And then after you hopefully like on their end, if they really like your work and they say they want to publish you, then it's about working with them to refine the work, right? And then once you are able to do that, then the book will come out, and then you have to do the marketing. I guess like one big thing that a lot of people, I guess, is the misconception about writing in Singapore is that some people think they can just write something under a pen name and then just like hide forever from it. I don't think that's the case anymore. I think at one point probably we were able to do that, but like right now with publishing in Singapore, we need to sort of like be our own spokesperson for our work. Hence why I'm here on this podcast. Right? So like we need to like go out there and be like, hey, this is something that I wrote, something that maybe is worth reading. And, you will also be part of a larger community where, you're promoting other people's works and you're talking about other books that you love in the space. In a very cursory level, like that's how I would sort of think about it, which is, start by taking it seriously, develop the work. Once you're done developing the work, then you sort of understand what it is, then you can send it out. And then once you send it out, and then hopefully you get a contract with a publisher and they're willing to publish you, then it's about how do we have this book have a life of its own. And that's something that I like to think about as well. Yeah. And then obviously, I would say when you're sort of engaging with a publisher, look at your contract very carefully, try to figure out whether like that's something that works for you. In Singapore, I would say like there's not a lot of money to be made when you're publishing a book. Royalties are not a lot. And so when, you're putting a book out, maybe your check comes to like 3 figures a year sometimes, right? And so don't depend on the book to be the thing that will get your name out there. You have to be there for the book as well. So it's a mutual relationship. Or like having your own baby, right? Like you're sending your baby to school and not like being like, hey baby, go do your own thing.
And leaving it there.
Yeah, leaving it there. No, you have to be part of that.
I thought that was really informative.
Thank you.
It really very much a glimpse behind the scenes of like, how do you go from I have an idea and I'm writing in my college dorm to Straits Times mention like yourself.
It's I mean, once you, I think honestly when you get a book out, like it's really not that hard to get in touch with reviewers to be like, hey, like I have this thing, would you be interested in reviewing it? In an ideal world, your publisher does that for you. I did not live in my ideal world because I published my book overseas. So when the books came in, I had to do a lot of that work myself to like, hey, tell people that this is out there. Yeah.
And then just say, hey, I'd love for you to review it. Let me know.
Yeah, I mean that's something that you can definitely do with like the big media outlets, like very easily. You can just like, the reviewers like emails are always on their byline. This is an email, I just copy and paste it into my Gmail and then send them like an email like, hey, I wrote this book. This is the synopsis. Would you be interested in reviewing? And then you can send over what we call an advanced reader's copy or ARC. And then that's when they can take it and write their review if they want, right? I will always say like, if you're a new writer, don't pressure people to review books. It's not a good sign. Be a nice person when you go out into the world and yeah, just have that human conversation with people about your art and about your work. Yeah.
But you wouldn't need to pay them for reviewing your work. It would be their own volition.
Yeah, of course. I mean, and review spaces, there's so many. There's Straits Times, CNA. I think there's some either like reviews or like media mentions. QLRS does reviews, and then there's other sort of like venues as well that you can explore as you sort of like go through that. But I tell you, most writers probably will not need to do that if you're getting published in Singapore anyway, because your publisher would be doing that for you. Focus on the writing and promoting the work. Yeah.
Quite cool. I mean, even as someone who's not really interested in publishing a book, it's just interesting to know the nuances behind an industry that we all kind of interact with daily. Like we
Yeah.
all read books.
Yeah.
Hopefully we all read books.
I mean, I will also say that like in some ways, like writing, when you're serious about it, it's also like your own like sort of small business.
You know,
if you're thinking about it.
we had an artist come on the podcast
Yeah.
and she said the same thing. She was like, I think art school does something really well, which is teaches you how to be an artist, but it doesn't teach you how to be an artist in the real world, which is really more of a small business.
Yeah. Yeah, when we think about like, for example, like even writing, right? How much time are you devoting to the craft that you don't know whether it's gonna pay off until you get the book deal, right? And then, you know, if you're getting published, say with a US publisher, like that can be your advance could be like very big compared to what you have here. Something to definitely think about as well. Like when you're working on something, how can that work be valued at a speed or at a rate where it is profitable for you to keep on doing that, right? And then that's how it sort of continues, like a small business.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons I really enjoyed Yellowface was also getting to hear a little bit more about this publishing industry, albeit they talk about it in the US and there's a different premise behind it. But it's interesting to dive behind it. So I'm quite curious, you're a creative nonfiction writer and you draw on your Thai identity, also your childhood experiences, even specific cultural spots like the Golden Mile. And so I just would love to hear more about how do you come up with these questions and that you're curious about for yourself, and then how do you kind of see the end to it?
So I guess like the easiest way to explain it is that like we all have things that bring us energy, right? I like to use the word obsession. Like we obsess over specific things in our lives, and everybody has their own obsession. Some people are obsessed with works, and I'm not judging you when you're obsessed with work, but you can be obsessed with other things too. Like
Max was looking directly at the camera.
I was like, you know, we can be obsessed over different things, and that's usually when I say obsession, it's usually something that you're constantly thinking a lot about, and that comes naturally to you, right? It's not like something where you have to think, oh yeah, like what is the furthest reaching thing that I can be obsessed with? No, it's like for me, I'm obsessed with language. I'm obsessed with like my Thai culture. I'm obsessed with food because I like to eat a lot, and my mother was a hawker, so food is literally in my like family trade. So when these things sort of come together, I think that's where you have a really good starting point for building writing about your own life. So for me, like how I got started was thinking about like, okay, so what are the things that like really matter to me a lot as a person? So for some people it could be family, right? It could be like, okay, I have like this relationship with my sister or my brother, and there's a lot of tension between us, and I really wonder like, I've been obsessively thinking about it for like many months. Like, how do I sort of put that to the page? But it could be like really simple things. Like I'm obsessed with like Thai BL shows.
Oh yes, you wrote about this.
I love Thai BL shows, and like I watch Thai BL shows like almost like religiously like every week. And something that I
BL stands for
Boys Love. It's like a genre of like television where it's like romance but like between boys. And now there's also like a girls love thing coming out of like the Thai media industry where like that's also girls love. But anyway, I watch a lot of these because like there's something that draws me into this narrative, right? Like I'm always thinking about like, okay, so what does it mean for me to like, why am I so obsessed with this? Why do I keep thinking about it? And I think that's where a lot of like that, what I mentioned, like this sort of train of thought sort of begins, right? It always begins with like, why am I so obsessed with this? Like what is this thing? And we all have our own obsession. So I always feel like everybody can always pursue what they're obsessed with. And that's when your writing becomes special and not like anyone else. Right now, there's a lot of conversation around AI and writing because there's a big thing about like NLP and the way that they use AI. So you can go look at that if you want. But I will always say that like creative nonfiction is a genre where AI cannot reproduce, because it is your own writing and your own thoughts and your own obsession and your own inquisition into all these things that makes for something that is uniquely yours. And so, I mean, the craft of writing begins, I think, from having all these questions that you want to answer, having all these obsessions about things that you constantly are interacting with or thinking about, and then trying to lay it out on the page. I have a Golden Mile piece published on Suspect Journal, and it was written like I think the month before the complex was slated to shut down. And I was like, oh my gosh, if there's anything I need to write about now, it's to capture this memory of a space where my mother and I used to go to a lot to eat Thai food, because she was trying to study like what does it mean to make Thai food for the Singaporean palate. And when I went there, and I was like, oh my gosh, there's just so much memory that I need to like make sure I get down, and to think about like what does it mean to be Thai in this country. Also, Golden Mile Complex is a Thai enclave, so that's where I think the sort of obsession and the writing comes together and creates its own thing. And I recently found out that Golden Mile is now slated to become a medical facility for rich and wealthy people to do their own medical things. And I'm a little sad because that's not going to be the same Golden Mile that I used to go to. Yeah.
Do they need another place to...
I'm not a property developer. I'm a writer.
I don't know ROI.
I don't know what I mean that view now is like the sort of like beachfront view that is now mainly reserved for rich people and not and not everyone else. Yeah.
Which is so ironic that a lot of these places very much like, homegrown places.
Yeah.
I mean, Outram Park, it was also, now it's just full of membership clubs and really expensive restaurants. I used to work there, and it was very expensive to get a lunch. So we always had to walk out to get to a hawker center because you don't want to spend $40 on a lunch.
Gosh, it's ridiculous. Yeah, no, I think something about Singapore specifically is that like this country changes so quickly. Like things are being torn down, things are like constantly moving, and like I think writing is one key way that we can preserve memory. Photographs and videos are great, but like there's something about that sort of like intimacy that one can have with a space that can only come through, I think, when you're like really writing it out. I mean, writing about places is going to be like a thing that I'm always going to be doing because I'm always writing about like in between Thailand and Singapore. And I've lived in many different parts of this country. It's an obsession with wanting to be heard, wanting your memory to be heard by other people that I think has propelled me in that way. And I would say, maybe just a quick plug, there is a novel coming out this year in May by Jemima Wei called The Original Daughter. And I remember going to her sort of pre-debut launch party, and she was talking about how she was trying to preserve like a memory of like olden days Singapore. I think by olden days she meant like 2000s Singapore, and how nowadays like some of the things that she wrote about in the book just doesn't exist anymore. I'm always thinking about like living here, how things move very quickly, and how sometimes we just need to like pause and be like, okay, I've lived here for so long. What is the experience? And that's where sometimes I also get my inspiration, right? Just being like, okay, yeah, like putting words to paper is putting memory to something that is a little bit more tangible.
I have a tendency in my interviews to go a little bit from the question.
Oh, please. All good.
So can you share a little bit about how your Thai identity influenced your writing?
Yeah. So I think when I'm thinking about how I exist in this country, in Singapore specifically, I'm always thinking about like what makes me like similar to or different from the people that I meet here. And a big part of that, I think, is I was born in Thailand, in Bangkok, and I moved here when I was very young. I was like, I think 7 or 8 years old. So I migrated here with my mother, who remarried to a Singaporean man. And I sort of grew up here, sort of living the Thai life like indoors, but then going out and sort of presenting as like this Chinese Singaporean. And so I always thought about how this Thainess has become a big part of who I am. And so when my mother passed, when I was like 14, 15, what I realized was that this sort of language, this identity was really like home, and I'm sort of living in between worlds, in between being Thai and being Singaporean. I did my NS here, for example. That's one thing that I think every sort of Singaporean biological male has to go through, and I also sort of went through that. So there's that, I think, element of like coming together. Yeah, and the question, I think, sorry, let's go back to the question. The question is, how has that Thai identity sort of influenced my writing? Is that right? Yeah, I think we don't see a lot of like Thai writers in Singapore. We also don't see a lot of Thai writers internationally. It's very interesting because I come from this perspective where I'm obviously writing in English, and there are very few writers who are from Thailand who write in English because Thailand was never formally colonized by any of the big powers. So the culture that is created in Thailand is mostly in Thai. And I think that's what makes like my relationship with the Thai language itself very special, because I'm always thinking about like, hey, you know, if these words are words that I use at home, these words are what I grew up with, how does that then translate to the English speaking world that I'm here? And then I realized that like I end up having to explain a lot to people that like, oh, you know, there are certain things that instinctively come to me in the Thai language that I think we don't have words for in English. And so that also becomes like a big part of the exploration of this book, because I'm always trying to like think about how do I explain myself to others, which is not a good thing to think about because you don't want to keep explaining yourself to other people. But that's a big part of what it means to assimilate into a country. And so that's where I think the book sort of really came about, is thinking about like how different facets of identity really influences the way that I grew up, the way that I sort of exist and be in this space. Yeah.
Where can our listeners find you?
You can find me on Instagram at Max Pasakorn or at Max PSK Writes. I have 2 Instagram accounts, one for my personal life and one for my writing life.
We can follow your personal life. That's what you're saying?
Yeah, it's public. You can. You can. Because I post like stuff there that I think is just more like about me and the way I'm living here. But like, I want to have a separate Instagram just for my writing, because, and my obsession with books, because I think that's also like something that I can use to really connect with other writers and other readers who I may not know in my personal life. You can also follow me on Twitter. My Twitter handle is at 62% homo, spelled PURCENTHOMO, and it is a reference to the Heartstopper series.
I think you won a few people over just from that.
Yeah, at one point, like one of the characters like goes and like does a sexuality test, and then the answer is 62% homosexual.
And you're like, yep.
Yeah, that's my Twitter handle now. Yeah, apparently 62% with a PER did not exist, so I had to do PUR. PUR. Yes. So yeah, those you can follow me on those spaces, and I also have a website where you can look at my work. It's www.maxpasakorn.works. Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Okay, last question. What is your favorite Thai word that does not have a direct English translation?
Okay, so I've been thinking about this a lot, and there's a Thai word called jeep, and jeep basically, in very like simplistic English terms, it's like to woo or to court. Typically used when like somebody being like, oh yeah, like I really want to like date this person, so I'm going to like jeep you. And then when that person like reciprocates, then you say you jeeped it, which means like the jeep has like attached to you. and so you're now like sort of like a couple. And I think that the word is very reminiscent of like this sort of single-mindedness of like monogamy, that it's like very romantic in nature, I guess, of like wanting to be a part of a pair, wanting to be a couple, right? And yeah, so it's always a word that I don't think there's a direct translation with the correct connotation of what it means. But also, when you say it with the Thai word for snack, khanom jeep, then it becomes siu mai. So, you know, the siu mai that you eat at dim sum restaurants? Yeah, so like that's, in Thai we call it the flirting snack, khanom jeep.
Oh.
Yeah, so that's, I think, a word that always comes back to me, and I hope to write about it someday.
Can't wait.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Max, for your time this evening.
Thank you, Betty.
Yay!
Yay!